today. I want to continue on the theme of inverted totalitarianism. It's very rare when we see journalists like Kit Clarenberg face the hard hand of the law, be actually forcibly taken into a room and interrogated and threatened, or Julian Assange in this system. They prefer to deal with independent media that threatens them with velvet glove censorship, labeling it disinformation, or just simply firing journalists who work within more mainstream or influential institutions because they threaten the establishment objectives that those institutions are intended to advance. I can give many, many examples of that taking place. I mean, even someone as non-threatening as Mark Lamont Hill, when he was at CNN, was fired for making some mild statement in support of Palestinian human rights on Twitter. There's very little deviation is allowed. And one example that I want to point to that illustrates this trend took place in New Zealand, which is sort of which is a frontline country for advancing this counter disinformation agenda under the watch of Jacinda Ardern, who's now on her way out and was a World Economic Forum pet project, seen as a avatar of the zero COVID model that locked down the entire country because there was one positive PCR test. She told people to watch what they say in public and not speak to their neighbors, to stay in their bubbles. And she's left the country in a state of liberal authoritarianism or neoliberal authoritarianism, where a single editor at Radio New Zealand, which is a state-sponsored media organization, has caused a national scandal. There is a national scandal at Radio New Zealand. It's been on the front pages of New Zealand's papers for weeks now. What happened there? Radio New Zealand has initiated an editorial audit over supposed pro-Russian editing of 22 stories which contain language that does not comport, this is my view, with U.S. State Department approved talking points. It'll become clear that my view is correct as we look at some of these edits. So basically there was one editor in there who was using language that you're not allowed to use anymore over hotly contested issues like Ukraine or Israel. Here's one edit that caused a national scandal. This story was edited to describe the Maidan revolution as a coup. The copy has been changed to remove this description. So what was the Maidan revolution if not a coup? An elected president was violently removed by mobs who were fighting riot police in Maidan Square throughout late 2013 and early 2014. The supposed Euromaidan revolution of dignity was not even popular among a majority of Ukrainians. A Washington Post poll at the time, February 2014, found only a plurality of Ukrainians supported it. It's the kind of Galician Western Ukrainians who live around Lviv and parts of Kiev. But, then you had an entire population that did not support it, who were massacred for not supporting it, and a civil war broke out. So you're not allowed to say that at Radio New Zealand. What's next? An article is under review because it failed to justify the Ukrainian government's raid of Orthodox churches. Previous version of this article left out the context from a church with alleged Moscow ties from the top of the story. This line has been added back. Why would you need to say that unless you were justifying the raid? I mean, you can add context about what the Ukrainian government itself says, but this is where Radio New Zealand is demanding that the editor justify the raid with their own language. All right. Reverted back to Reuters copy. We're so sorry about that. This article contains a reference to undisputed truth. And they couldn't even spell Maidan right in their editorial correction. A previous article, the version of this article, referred to military action being provoked by NATO expanding to its borders and a US instigated coup in Ukraine during the 2014 Maidan protests. Spelled it wrong. This reference was removed. So you're not allowed to note that military action, in other words, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, had anything to do with the NATOization of Ukraine, placing hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons and troops trained by NATO and the US on Russia's immediate borders. Can't do that. This is great. A previous article, a version of this article, referred to neo-Nazism. You're not allowed to use the term neo-Nazism in the context of Ukraine. Those swastikas you see, those are, sometimes you see them displayed at marches honoring Stepan Bandera. Those are just Hindu symbols of wisdom. So we take this extremely seriously. We removed that at Radio New Zealand. Here's another good one. A previous version of this article included a section at the end to include this line. This implies that Russian forces must leave not just the territory occupied in recent weeks since their invasion in February, but also Crimea, which it annexed 8 years ago after a referendum, and parts of the eastern Donbass region. This has now been removed. So you're not, basically, what is the problem with this language? The problem is that you're not allowed to say that a referendum took place in Crimea. And you're not allowed to just refer to all of this as occupied territory. You have to refer to it all as occupied territory. Too much context. The referendum in Crimea showed that over 80% of residents of Crimea wanted to be removed from the control of the nationalist government in Kiev. An NBC News reporter went to Crimea 3 months ago or so and found that the population is completely mobilized in support of the Russian Federation's war. They don't want to be part of a government that is hostile to them and the Russian language. So what was removed from this article? I mean, this could go on. The removals and edits could go on all day. I might have to stop soon, but Tokyo worries that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has set a precedent that will encourage China to attack self-ruled Taiwan. And then it was changed to language, self-ruled Taiwan, who the US is stocking up on weapons. That language was added. Context was added to help readers understand why China and Taiwan are experiencing such tensions. The stocking up on weapons has been removed. Taiwan's not stocking up on weapons. It's just there. China just hates it because it's there and it's free. I mean, that is how a lot of the experts in Washington understand it. It's just autocracy versus democracy. But this is autocracy through inverted form, removing this language and stirring up a national scandal because there's some editor who's adding inappropriate context. I mean, it's the same thing here, removing language that says that China says the US is fanning flames by sending weapons to Ukraine. You can't cite the Chinese perspective to help readers understand. I mean, there's stuff about Israel in there. This article was inappropriate, or the language is inappropriate because it did not refer to several of the Palestinians killed by Israel as gunmen. So you have to add context to justify Israeli violence, but anything that provides context about US conflict with China or Russia must be removed. So that really helps us understand the context. It helps us understand the political environment in New Zealand. And New Zealand really is kind of a test case for the rest of the West, as I've been saying. Something really, here's something that took place under Jacinda Ardern's watch that also highlights how media is being managed by the state under democratic guise. And it was reported by The Guardian in a completely propagandistic way. New Zealand to give 50 million to help ailing media groups during COVID-19 crisis. This was about creating a slush fund for Jacinda Ardern to fund media to advance her zero COVID agenda and to demonize and attack whatever alternative media existed as disinformation, Nazis, you know the deal. So something like $2.7 million of that $50 million slush fund went to an outlet called Stuff. Stuff is basically like a public-private partnership, but it poses as independent media. And Stuff led a campaign to literally ban a magazine in New Zealand called New Dawn, which is one of the few mass circulation alternative medias in New Zealand. Someone call it, a conspiracy site. It definitely went hard against the zero COVID regime that prevailed in New Zealand, that kept New Zealanders in some of the longest lockdowns on the planet. But there was one article in particular that they highlighted to attack this publication and get it banned. Let me just show, this is one of the few outlets that actually covered this, was 21st Century Wire. And the cover, you can see the cover of New Dawn here, has a masked, obedient urban dweller injected with multiple syringes. So the cover itself was highly provocative. It was, poking the Ardern government in the eye. That may be a reason why this was removed from stores. All retailers were pressured and distributors to remove this magazine. But there was also an article in it by TJ Coles, who has contributed to the Grayzone. He's written for us about he's contributed to us about US and British militarism in Africa. That was the subject of his last book. It's a well-reviewed book, and his pieces added a lot. And he published a piece about probably the most sensitive issue in New Zealand today, which is the Christchurch massacre by Brandon Tarrant. It is illegal in New Zealand to distribute footage of that massacre, which he filmed on a helmet cam, or to tell people where they can find that footage. And nowhere in TJ Cole's piece did he do that. What he did was he raised questions about Brandon Tarrant's links to the national security state. He's a former special forces officer. He had, I believe, somehow wound up in North Korea. He had traveled all around the world. And I don't know, I haven't studied this case enough to weigh in here, but it's just important to note what the content of the article was. And so New Dawn was accused of insinuating that the Christchurch massacre was a false flag. Nowhere in TJ Cole's piece did he say that it was a false flag. He noted many unusual circumstances that day in how the massacre was reported and about Brandon Tarrant's background. I am not going to draw any conclusions about the Christchurch massacre here. But we know that there is a long history of in the US, federal involvement with certain mass shooters. For example, Elton Simpson, who went to the Draw Muhammad contest in Garland, Texas, with his FBI handlers in tow, undercover handlers following him to make sure that he carried out a shooting at this center. He actually managed to shoot a cop in the leg before he was taken down. And he was told by an FBI informant, this is a person who was in jail, who was mentally disturbed, converted to Salafi Islam. He was told to tear up Texas hours before carrying out this shooting. So the FBI was egging him on. This is one of several examples. I believe it was 2013, there was a neo-Nazi named F. Glenn Frazier, veteran neo-Nazi, who went out in what he thought was going to be a blaze of glory in Kansas City. He was an old, decrepit man who was completely crazed, and he went and attempted to kill Jews at Jewish community centers and wound up killing 3 people outside who were not even Jewish. He had been maintaining on a chat site like American Vanguard or one of these neo-Nazi chat sites, chat logs. He'd, written like 80,000 comments. One of those comments was about me. He called me a Jew journalist and linked to a video I did, like an interview I did about Sheldon Adelson's like influence on the Republican Party. So he wasn't even favorable to me. But some pro-Israel operatives on Twitter took that comment by him, screenshotted it, and then began blasting it all over social media, claiming that I was the mentor of a neo-Nazi mass shooter. And it got to the point where the Free Beacon, Neocon Rag in DC, and Haaretz, the premier liberal newspaper in Israel, actually reported that I was the mentor of a neo-Nazi mass shooter. So it just became this giant psyop to discredit me because I was, taking on Israeli apartheid. And Haaretz eventually retracted its article. It was totally fake. But I hadn't even thought much about this mass shooting. I then looked into this guy, Glenn Frazier, and I learned that he had been recruited by the FBI while he was in prison and had been maintaining a role as a federal informant throughout much of his life. So they knew a lot about him, but somehow weren't able to keep him under control. So the point is, I think it's legitimate to raise questions. And New Zealand has banned an entire magazine from circulation. And it's been banned through, of course, private entities under pressure from a public, from a outlet, Stuff, that is funded through Jacinda Ardern's slush fund. They banned it on the basis of simply raising questions about something that is extremely sensitive. And it's coming here. It's going to, this regime of censorship is coming here through various means. We talk about it all the time. One way that it will come here is through in the legal enforcement of nebulous abstract concepts like safety. So here is a comment by an Irish legislator from the Green Party who just says it openly. And we hear this language from AOC a lot about safety or literal violence, which is something that is often not literal. I remember when literal violence used to be like the beatdown of Rodney King or bombing a country. But I haven't heard it spoken so nakedly before.
When you think about it, all law, all legislation is about the restriction of freedom. That's exactly what we're doing here, is we are restricting freedom, but we're doing it for the common good. You will see throughout our Constitution, yes, you have rights, but they are restricted for the common good. Everything needs to be balanced. And if your views on other people's identities go to make their lives unsafe, insecure, and cause them such deep discomfort that they cannot live in peace, then I believe that it is our job as legislators to restrict those freedoms for the common good.
So she's not talking about literal violence. She's talking about certain groups being made to feel uncomfortable. Those who do that through their language must be restricted. In other words, they must be criminalized. This is a debate over a hate speech and incitement bill. Now, a lot of people on the left support this. I mean, this is a leftist legislator from the Green Party. But let's consider something that happened closer to home with a student at the City University for New York Law School commencement, Fatima Mohammed, who's of Yemeni descent. She delivered a speech in which it was an incendiary speech condemning Israeli apartheid. And she has been condemned in response by everyone from the New York City mayor, Eric Adams, to Senator Ted Cruz in Texas, to this guy, Richie Torres, who's a congressman in the Bronx, like next door to AOC, who's just completely owned by the Israel lobby, like just one of the top recipients of AIPAC. He's just there to be black face sprouting or Puerto Rican face sprouting pro-Israel rhetoric. And they've all called for the school to punish her, they're essentially wanting to criminalize her for her speech. And I was watching an ultra-Zionist professor at CUNY condemn her in an interview with the New York Post. The New York Post has been all over this. And he said that what he said is Zionists are a protected group and you are in violation of the law if you are making a protected group feel unsafe. So this is a right-wing pro-Israel figure saying the same thing this left-wing Irish legislator said. And he's conflating Judaism with Zionism, which is what anti-Semites do. Zionists are not an ethnic group. That is an ideological position that many Christians actually uphold, many Gentiles uphold, because they see Israel as the future landing pad for the Messiah. So we're in a very dangerous place when we start legislating what hate, rhetorical hate, and incitement is, but we're going there. Who determines what disinformation is? When Rachel Maddow refuses to show a Donald Trump press conference responding to the indictment because he will speak lies, she's determining what the truth is when she has spouted some of the most consequential forms of disinformation and lies in the last 6 years. So it's not something, this is not a regime, this inverted totalitarian regime of censorship that will target exclusively the right, although it is disproportionately targeting the right now. We can see it's impacting the left. In fact, let me show you this if I can pull it up. Here's something that took place clearly under state pressure, and we don't know which state it is. We've seen the FBI go to Twitter on behalf of the Ukrainian intelligence services and ask them to remove Aaron Mate's account. But here we have City University of New York's Jewish Law Student Association, who supported Fatima Mohammed's right to free speech, having their statement of support removed by Google Docs under violation of terms of service. Just a Google Doc was removed because it supported a student who said naughty things about Israel. And it's a classic case of inverted totalitarianism where a corporation is claiming that its terms of services have been violated, but there is obvious state pressure here. But the state doesn't have to take responsibility. There are no state fingerprints. So we're not looking at this as state censorship when it in fact is.